Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and this is another one of my videos in my series on academic writing tips. And today I'll briefly talk about how to incorporate contradictory sources in your paper or in your thesis. So what do I mean by contradictory sources? These are articles, books, arguments that might be counter to the theorist or writers whose work you're using as part of your secondary research. For example, let's say you're using Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Right now, the essay was published like 30 years ago, right? So obviously there are people who have challenged it, right? Spivak herself acknowledges the challenge within the essay. So it would be prudent to point out in the body of your work that you are aware of those critiques. Now there are different ways of doing that. One is that as you're explaining your secondary sources, as I pointed out in my video on secondary sources, you incorporate in that discussion the critiques of the theory that you're using. Who mounted that critique? What was it about? And then how do you yourself address it within the body of your essay? That would be if you're writing a longer piece and you have the space to incorporate your response to the critiques of the sources that you're using. Now let's assume it's just a 10,000 word essay and you do not have much of a room there. So I still recommend putting in a footnote there and explaining that you have read so and so and so who have critiqued this essay, but don't find the need to engage that debate in the current paper that you are writing. Now, what's the purpose of that? Now, of course, the deeply philosophical purpose is that as you're writing the paper, you want to be aware of the debates about the secondary sources that you're mobilizing. And that's what will make your own thought and your own writing, of course, more sophisticated, right? More well-informed. But there are also pragmatic concerns. One of them being, let's say if you're going to submit this essay to someone or to a committee, you don't want them to point out that you didn't incorporate or take into account the critiques of what you just mobilized as your theory or your secondary source. So you want to safeguard against that. If you're submitting it to a journal, obviously the reviewers are also going to point that out. And that's one of the main things the reviewers see. Trust me, I've reviewed essays for a lot of journals in my past life, and you want to figure out if someone is mobilizing or using a certain theorist or their work, whether or not they're aware of the challenges to that work. And if they are, do they incorporate it within the body of the work, or do they at least put a footnote there acknowledging that they are aware of it? One thing that you absolutely cannot do and do not do in a research paper, at least in literary studies and humanities, is not do the research to find out what are some major critiques of the work that you're mobilizing, because that points to the reviewer that technically that you probably don't know the subject in depth or you haven't done your research, right? And that's applicable to short papers as well as long papers. And that's why I always, I used to teach my students when I was an active professor, and I still teach through this channel, that scholarship, literary scholarship or other kinds of scholarships are a conversation. And you can only have a conversation when you already know where the debate is, right? You cannot write, as Peter Elbow would say, I think he's the one who said it, out of your non-knowledge, or he uses the term ignorance. You have to write from a place of knowing, right? And accounting for sources that challenge or contradict the assumptions of the sources that you're mobilizing is one way of entering the conversation, knowing well what the critiques are. So, for example, anytime when I use Fanon in my scholarly work, I point out that Fanon is often, by the conservative scholars offered as this prophet of violence, right? Which he is not if you read his work within the paradigm of psychoanalysis, right? Because he's trying to teach us how to heal an oppressed psyche. Similarly, if you're using Marx, Foucault, Derrida, it would be apt to read further and then find out what are some of the critiques of their work and how do you account for that in your paper. Accounting for the critiques of the secondary sources that you're mobilizing in your paper or in your thesis is not something which is on the periphery of your project. It's actually extremely important to the integrity of your project, but also to the expansiveness and sophistication of your own thought as a scholar and your own development as a scholar. And as I mentioned, train yourself to do that. Every time you feel like citing a source, ask yourself, is there someone who opposed this person's point of view? Look it up, right? And if there is someone, engage with it. Bring it into discussion, either within the body of your paper or in a footnote. Trust me, if you keep this in mind and keep writing like this, you'll have more success. Now, it goes without saying that for all these practices that I just mentioned, your paper will have to be one of the argumentative papers, right? A paper that argues for a point of view, right? Because when you do that, then you will be supporting your argument. It might also apply to an analytical paper or even, an exploratory thesis where you're explaining something, right? And if you're explaining something just from one point of view and don't account for the opposing point of view, then your work will not come across as sophisticated. Now, one mistake we must not make in the process of doing that. Let's never create false equivalencies, right? Sometimes the counter-argument is a weak argument. It's not well thought out. They have misread the text that you're using. Point that out. I find that with a lot of critiques of, Said's Orientalism. People who criticize Orientalism forget the basic intent of the book. Like one of the critiques that comes often is the natives have no voice here. They just come across as the construct of European work and imagination. Well, the point is that is what he is trying to prove in the book. He's not trying to prove the native agency. The project of the book is how does a discourse emerge that pre-decides for the European reader the imagery and the imagination about the Orient, even when they're there, or even if they have never been there. That is what he's trying to highlight. So in that, then, his focus is on the discourse itself and not necessarily the acts of agency and resistance that were being mobilized by the natives. That he does in his other works, right? Remember, his first major book, was The Question of Palestine, one of the most erudite books on the history of Palestinian people. So, keep these things in mind. If you're mobilizing a source or a resource, secondary source, an essay, find out if there are opposing points of view to that, bring them into discussion And then your paper obviously will be more sophisticated, it will be richer, and your discussion will benefit from it and will be richer. That's it. I hope this is useful to you. Let me know what you think. I will keep producing such brief videos so that more and more of you can, share them and join them. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so far. If you feel like supporting my efforts and this channel, all the options are available below this video, as well as membership options. Just use your imagination, but at least leave me a comment and tell me what you think. That's all. Stay safe, take care of each other, be generous and kind. I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.